Hi. It used to be that small budget MIDI controllers were simple and underpowered. That's no longer the case. We are increasingly seeing better quality hardware, more built-in features, a better software bundle, and better DAW compatibility. The trigger for making this video is the new MPK Mini MK4. But as I go through what it can do, I'll compare it to the current competition, as well as the previous MK3 version, and you can use this as a checklist when comparing it to controllers that may come in the future too. I'll also check out its new Studio Instrument Collection software and how it integrates into Akai's ecosystem of plugins. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Akai sent me this controller. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's dive right in, starting with the Keybed. When you consider buying a compact controller, it's important to know that not all mini keys are created equal, not in feel and not in size. For example, the MPK Mini MK3 keys are only 8 centimeters deep compared to 9 centimeters here, and 29 centimeters wide compared to 31 on the new MK4. If you have small hands, that might not make much of a difference to you, but for me, it's a big deal. I enjoy this size much more. By the way, just to compare, the Launchkey MK4 keys are wider, but also not deep, again making playing, at least for me, feel more cramped. One last comparison, this is the Minilab MK3, and you can see it's bigger overall, but the keys are pretty much as deep, maybe a bit wider. All the keybeds in this class are velocity sensitive. This and the other comparators I showed you don't have aftertouch. If you want aftertouch, you'll need to pay more and start trading off other features. Another trade-off in this price range is 2 octaves. You'll need to pay more for 32 keys or beyond, and those keybeds will have their pros and cons too. But certainly if you like to play, more space is better. Next up from left to right are the pitch and mod wheels. These are pretty small, but physical wheels are a big deal if you use these a lot. I don't use these much, but when I do, I prefer real wheels to touch strips on all its competitors in this price range. And unlike touch strips, it's hard to trigger these with an errant pinky. A quick word on the joystick on the MPK Mini MK3. Personally, I don't think it's good to have a single physical controller for 2 parameters unless you're controlling a flight simulator. And most software responds to a mod wheel controller that stays in place as opposed to one that bounces back to the center position. That said, the advantage of a joystick controller on the MPK Mini MK3 is that it can be programmed to send different CCs for any of its 4 directions, so potentially you can use it to control up to 4 parameters at once, as long as you're okay with them bouncing back to 0 when you're done. Okay, let's move on and talk about the pads. These are smaller than on the MPK Mini MK3. They're about the same size as the Minilab and bigger than those on the Launchkey, so it's a good sweet spot in the middle. The pads are both velocity and pressure sensitive, and they can be configured to send either channel or polyphonic aftertouch messages. So while the Keybed doesn't have aftertouch, you can play expressive melodic instruments with polyphonic aftertouch using these pads. Pressure sensitivity also works well in note repeat mode, where you control the dynamics of the sound based on how hard you press. Their feel is on the stiffer side, like those on the MK3, compared to the lighter touch needed on the Launchkey. And then of course the biggest thing to consider pad-wise is that there are 8 of them, not 16, so you'll need to be swapping between 2 banks to get to all 16 sounds. 16 pads are also more useful when launching clips in Ableton Live. The pads, by the way, can be in one of several different modes, as we'll see later in the video. The basics when using this as a MIDI controller without a DAW is that they can be programmed to either send notes, send MIDI CCs, or send program changes. Then on the knobs side, we've got 8 endless encoders. I like these. I think they're really good. Their layout is an upgrade compared to the MK3, I think, where they were too close to each other and my fingers touched one while turning the other. The only keyboard with an advantage when controlling continuous parameters is the Minilab 3, which on top of 8 knobs also has 4 additional faders. Its pad layout, by the way, is in a row, which I think is less convenient for finger drumming. The knobs here have multiple functions, either controlling DAW mix or device parameters, and also for controlling various arpeggiator parameters. Continuing our tour front and center, we've got a nice color screen with great viewing angles, and you control it with the detent encoder under it, which you use to, say, go through menus or to select items and then make changes. It's obviously not huge, but bigger than some of its competitors, certainly much bigger than the Mark III, and fits 3 rows nicely. I think the size of the text here is just like the labels on the panel. Continuing our tour, we've got plenty of buttons for transport controls and other hands-on parameters. These are all, along with their shift functions, particularly useful when controlling a DAW. You've got 2 factory presets for the pads and the knobs, one for controlling a DAW and another for interfacing with Akai's plugin, which I'll show you in a bit. And then beside that, you've got 13 other user presets, which you can program any way you like using the onboard program edit function. Let's complete the tour of the hardware by taking a look at connectivity. This keyboard, like its counterparts, is powered by USB-C, and USB-C also sends MIDI back and forth to a computer, tablet, or phone. New to the Mark IV compared to the Mark III is also a 5-pin DIN MIDI output. Absent on the connectivity side are Bluetooth or battery power or control voltage outputs, which you may find on more expensive controllers. Speaking of USB, when you plug the MPK Mini Mark IV into your computer, you'll see up to 5 USB ports on it. The important ones to pay attention to are the MIDI ports and the DAW ports. Okay, so that's what's going on with the physical hardware. Equally, if not more important, are the brains they've programmed into the controller. These will work regardless of whether you use this with hardware or with a software instrument. Let's start with the chord implementation. You activate chord mode by pressing Shift and pressing here. And then each note will play a chord that transposes across the keybed. You can't program your own chords here, but there are quite a few to choose from if we enter chords config. And the types are either degrees of a scale, which you can choose. So this is the major scale, but I can choose, say, any of these. And then once I've chosen my scale, I can choose various degree options. And then these are chords that work regardless of scale. Then you've got an optional inversion function. So you choose an inversion and then Shift activates that. And then one last feature is once you've chosen a scale, then transpose will transpose any notes that are out of the scale, or you can just ignore anytime you press a key that's not in the scale. So that's cool. It would be even nicer to see a chord bank function where you can program, say, different chords into different pads and perhaps get a few factory chord packs like you do on the Launchkey Mark IV. Then beside that, regardless of chords, you've also got a scale mode, which you can, of course, configure. So this is just a simple no wrong keys played scale mode. It's currently set to ignore, so we won't hear any notes that are out of the scale. But if we turn on transpose, then we can choose any scale we like and never hit any notes that are out of the scale. Just be sure to try out the black keys every now and then. Otherwise, you might miss the point of the scale. There are plenty of scale options to explore here, so that's a good thing. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the built-in arpeggiator. All the keyboards in this class have had this feature for a while, so we're looking for some innovation, and the MPK Mini Mark IV delivers in an interesting way. Let's first take a look at the basics. You turn on the arpeggiator by pressing this button, and you can latch it by pressing latch, and then you can configure its settings either by holding the ARP button and pressing the keys as per their label on the panel. So you can set the time division, the play direction, including random and chords, the number of octaves the arpeggiator will play through, and this goes both down and up, swing. We'll get to these advanced features in a bit, but you can set sync to be either internal or external. External syncs up, say, to your DAW, and internal uses the internal clock. Like I mentioned earlier, you can control the various modes using these encoders. I think it's more convenient to use the keys, but some parameters aren't available on the keys. For example, the gate length. And things get interesting over here. So let's start with mutate. That's the simplest one. Turning mutate on will transpose an octave based on a certain probability. which is the mutate probability. So the higher that is, the more likely a transpose is to happen. So that's an okay mutation. Some other keyboards do more. And then rhythmic pattern is an interesting one. Let's get an ARP going and go into the menu after turning it on. We've got a few views or modes, and the pad color changes based on the mode we're in, or view. The first is accent mode, and I'll increase the accent amount so we can hear this better. I'm gonna overdo this intentionally so we can hear it. And the pattern length can be either 8 or 16 steps. Let's go for 8. Anyway, yellow steps are accented, and I can also enter rests by turning steps off. And the behavior during a rest can be either to skip a note in the pattern, that's determined in the style, or just to wait and continue the pattern. And then we've got 2 more views or sequencing modes. One of them is sustain mode, where we can choose to sustain certain steps in the pattern. Sustain steps are blue. And the second mode is ratchet mode, where, as you may have guessed, you can choose which steps we want to trigger ratchets on. Once we're done creating our rhythmic masterpiece, we can save it into one of 16 slots. Let's save this in slot 4. And in this view, we can swap patterns just by pressing the pads. Pads 1 and 4 are lit up, showing us that there are patterns saved in them. And then freeze is a fun one. It lets you set an ARP and freeze the keyboard, then play on top of it on another MIDI channel if you want. Unfreeze, change the ARP, freeze again, and again send notes to a second pattern. And so on. Then finally there's note repeat, which, like I mentioned earlier, responds nicely to pressure. You can change the rates either by holding note repeat and changing the rate that way, or just entering the note repeat config menu. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you could. Okay, so that's it as far as what the Mark IV can do on its own. Let's take a look at a couple of specific software integrations. Akai is providing scripts for Logic Pro, FL Studio, Bitwig, and Cubase. If you want to see what it can do with those, just download the documents of the specific integration and check them out. I use Ableton Live, so let's take a look at what that integration looks like. You've got transport controls, record into the context, whether it's the arranger or the session. You've got metronome controls and tap tempo, automation control, both on and off. And again, this depends within Ableton Live on the context. There's undo and redo. You can turn looping on and off. We can navigate through the tracks and see their track names, and colors are always nice to have. The device that we're looking at. We can navigate between devices by moving the blue hand, the blue controller hand, across the different devices. Then of course you've got device controls. You can see the parameter name on screen. And if you've got a device with more than one bank of parameters, you can move between banks of parameters with shift and plus and minus. And then these can also be used as mixer controls. Hold shift and press the main screen encoder. And now we're controlling track panning and level with the 2 left knobs. And then various sends depending on how many you have in your project. And then if you're looking at the session grid, you can move between scenes using the screen encoder and trigger scenes by pressing it. Swap scenes. And then the pads can also be used within the session grid. If you hit shift and move from notes mode, where they're used for drums, to CC mode, then the bottom 4 pads can be used to arm tracks or to unarm tracks. Then the top 4 can be used to stop clips based on what the grid window is looking at. So for example, here I'm focusing on this portion of the grid, and I could stop these clips. And if I were to shift the window that I was looking into the grid a little bit to the right, then I could stop this track as well. And as you can see, my window is 4x4 because if we go into program change mode, which is really clip launch mode, then I've got a view into the various clips within the window, and then I could trigger and swap clips like this. And if I hit bank change, then I'll see the bottom 4 clips. Let's hit bank change to go back home to the top row, swap the chord, then I could go into stop clips mode and stop the clips. So it's certainly a very small view into the grid, but I guess you can work it within limits. Okay, so that's the DAW integration, and then the MPK Mini MK4 comes bundled with Akai's new Studio Instrument Collection, which is a mouthful, so I'm going to call it SIC for short. This is both a standalone piece of software and a plugin you can run in your DAW. The SIC is a container for Akai presets from across their collection of instruments and plugins. If you're familiar with Analog Lab from Arturia, the idea is the same. This has a collection of sounds using engines from Akai's various plugins without giving you access to the full plugin's interface and all of its presets. You need to buy the plugin for that. Rather, you get a select few patches from each of the instruments. There's certainly a nice variety here. I think you get about 1,000 presets in total. And once you select an instrument, you can play a few dozen of its presets. As you can see, Akai is hinting at some plugins to come here. And like I mentioned, you don't get access to the full instrument, rather you control it using these 8 macros. You can also use the plus and minus buttons to browse through presets. If you're working within a DAW, just make sure that you're in plugin mode to see these parameters. Interestingly, this also comes with drum kits. Now I've got a few MPC expansions installed and it detected those. I think you only get these bundled with a keyboard, but yeah, a few to choose from. Don't forget there are 2 banks of sounds in each. Anyway, this is browse mode either for kits or for sounds, like I mentioned earlier, and we can just unselect the specific instruments to see all the presets and go into the All tab to sort by additional categories beyond plugin. For example, sound types, regardless of the plugin. Plugins, by the way, are software synths and instruments are multi-sampled instruments. Now, when you use this software standalone, you can play both the keys and the drums. When you use it as a plugin, it's just one of each at a time, but you can have 2 instances of the plugin, of course. And then just a quick word about play mode. This just gives you a cleaner look into both the synth and the drum kit you loaded. This lets you see the individual pad names across the 2 banks. And in drum kits, the knobs can control either level, panning, pitch, or a filter. Okay, moving on to a few miscellaneous items. Like I mentioned earlier, you can use the MPK Mini MK4 as a generic controller when it's not connected to anything using one of 15 or 13 user presets. And these 2 presets, these control presets have settings by default assigned to the knobs and to the pads. There's no software to edit these currently, but if you hit Shift and Program Edit, you can move the control that you want to edit or the pad you want to edit and edit their parameters. Pads get a channel, a note number, and then program change and CC for when they're in program change or CC modes. And you can also change pad colors. And then for the knobs, you can choose their CC, low and high value, and move them from absolute to relative mode, depending on what you're controlling. There's no MIDI learn, and you can't give the knobs or pads names, at least not currently, unfortunately. So right now it's just knob 1, knob 2, 3, 4, 5. Hopefully they add that either within the program edit function or just using software. And if you like the way you programmed it, just hit Shift and Octave Plus to save. Don't forget to press Enter. Then finally, before we head out to the pros and cons, let's check out the global settings. This lets you set the channel for the keys and the pads, and also velocity curves for the keys, aftertouch modes, and a few other settings. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for the MPK Mini Mark IV. First, a quick comparison to the Mark III. I think that's an easy one unless you find it at a really good price or you really want a joystick controller instead of mod and pitch wheels, or the bigger pads and slightly more compact form factor are important for you. It's also nice that the Mark III has a software-based editor, but that might change here. Regardless, I think the Mark IV is significantly better. The Mini Mark III was starting to get long in the tooth compared to the new competition, so with the Mark IV, Akai is back in the ring and throws a few pretty good punches. It's got a great balance of modern features, good keys, real pitch and mod wheels as opposed to touch strips, solid encoders and pads, an excellent set of DAW controls, a fun arpeggiator with interesting rhythmic features, and there are 2 colorways to choose from, which never hurts. In terms of DAW integration, it's got quite a few to choose from, and the integration with Ableton Live is excellent. Device controls work well, it's easy to swap devices. You've got a nice view into the grid, albeit small, and a way to both select and to launch scenes. The screen is small but excellent and sharp and gives you a nice view into where it is you're controlling and the parameter value. And then finally for the pros, the Studio Instrument Collection is a welcome addition with 1,000 presets that, in my opinion, sound great. So you've got something to get started with. Then on the cons side, 16 pads is certainly better than 8, even though you've got banking options. And in terms of continuous controls, knobs are great, but some of you may prefer faders. And then the chord options are nice, but it's mainly about transposing a single chord as opposed to what I think is preferable, the option to program different chords into different pads, or to get a bunch of factory banks built in to get you going. Then you can customize this using Program Edit, but you can't name the controls like you can on some other controllers. And there's no sequencer here, neither built in or one that creates clips in your DAW, again, like you can, for example, on the Launchkey Mark IV. It's a tough call between these 3, I have to say. I like the bigger keys on these 2 compared to the cramped one on this. Arturia's software bundle and faders are great, but the new Studio Instrument Collection gives it a good run for its money. I don't like touch strips, so these are great, but I do like the number of pads and chord banks here. And then this leads in terms of DAW button controls. So it's not an easy choice. Hopefully this video helped. Whatever you choose, I've got hundreds of sampled modern analog instruments available to play these with on my Patreon, along with my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.